All right, welcome back to another video. Uh, been a little bit since the first video here, but I have my text document, which was really the only place we made any progress. I also saved the plant UML that we started for our diagrams, and eventually we're going to need a lot of diagrams, right? Deployment use cases. I feel like this is the documentation of my dreams. Is the end goal of this series in general, right? Is to really create a ton of documentation for a platform we don't even build. But I don't want I don't want there to be lingering questions about the design. Okay. We made a little next time thing in the end of the last session, right? Where we talked about things that we still need to do, right? Diagrams for real, actually building the diagrams and not just our kind of notes that we've been taking based on our, kind of high level design. A look at non-Kerberos based designs. So last time, the entire session was really a tangent in developing my own kind of Kerberos based SSO use case. And we did that mainly because Kerberos was the only one I had really heard of. I didn't, and if anything, I want this video to be, or this series to be, kind of slow and researched and methodical, right? So probably a surprise to hear that I'm saying that these videos are going too fast, and I want them to be slower. But that is the truth. I want these to be, very slow and serious. Because that's how I think real system design is. It's calculated. It's not, throwing things down as fast as you can, riddling off trade-offs based off things you've heard, and then forging ahead. Like you want to feel confident in your design, or at least I do. Okay, these are things that we did not address in whatever design I did have. How to do single sign-off and how token expiration would work, which is not it's not even that I didn't tackle them. I am not sure how to do them. Right, that's kind of an unaddressed issue, and it needs to be addressed if we want a robust system. I'm also curious how other Kerberos-based designs handle these things, but anyways. And then we got to talk about what that database really is. And if it's not an LDAP, what exactly is it? Obviously, I want some sort of relational database, but how do I access it? What are those APIs? That's got to be clear. Okay, one other thing that I've been thinking about since we had this, or since I did this first session, that's been on my mind constantly is, what are the known vulnerabilities of Kerberos? I love this idea that I started playing around with things and trying to identify vulnerabilities myself, which is, I guess, a good time. Let me see if I can find the weaknesses or identify weaknesses and create something that's better. But obviously, it's been around forever. There are people much more familiar with security than I. So I'm sure that they found some far more serious vulnerabilities. And there's probably steps that you have to take to address these, or so known vulnerabilities of Kerberos. And I keep writing Kerberos here, but one of the first things we need to do, right, is look at these other single sign-on design implementations and or architectures and see if maybe one of those is actually better. So I don't know if we'll even get to the diagrams in this video. we've gotta shore up some of these use cases. Okay, let's pick it up. Go back to where we ended last time. There were these common configurations. Here we go. Configuration is the right word. Okay. So this is kind of what we built. Where, there's an initial bit of authentication that grants a ticket generating ticket or ticket granting ticket. And then additional applications perform re-authentication kind of under the hood with this TGT, right? Looks like Windows, Unix, there's a lot of support for this. Smart card based. Initial sign-on prompts the user for the smart card. Additional software applications also use the smart card without prompting the user to re-enter credentials. Smart card-based single sign-on can either use certificates or passwords stored on the smart card. Interesting. Let's look a little closer here. So this is like embedded integrated. Is this like an RFID card? Or is this something different? Smart cards pattern of metal contacts to electrically connect to the internal chip. Is this like plastic credit card size card? This is not like RFID. There's a physical connection. Is this like chip payment? Is that what this is? Oh, some are contactless. So maybe some sort of RFID thing. Whoa, too quick. All right. Identification, financial, public transit, computer security, schools, and healthcare. Smart cards provide strong authentication for single sign-on within organizations. Numerous nations have deployed smart cards throughout their populations. That's interesting. But they're talking about like national identity cards having some sort of integrated circuit chip, having a chip. Okay, payment card. Okay, so I was right about the payment card, right? That's what we're talking about, like chip cards. Europay MasterCard, compliant cards. Yeah, so this is talking about complex cards, smart cards that conform to this ISO standard. Components in addition to those found in traditional. Okay. And I'm sure that there are so many algorithms to do like handoffs, whatever's in the integrated circuit. I don't know that it necessarily has a secret key in there, but and I don't really know what happens when you put a chip into a chip card into a reader, but there might be some sort of, the integrated circuit might take a couple cycles, of electricity that maybe increment values internally. It maybe stores values. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it just reads kind of a burned-in code or something like that. Okay. All in all, right? This is probably not useful for our situation, right? I mean, it's just because I guess it could be. Part of my design could be that every user has to have a physical card, which adds a level of security that I guess I wasn't considering, right? I mean, they talk about the ability to use this in healthcare, schools, computer security, public transit, identification, and finance. I mean, identification and computer security are literally in there. And then schools, healthcare, and public transit, like literally use cases I talked about. So maybe I should be considering a smart card. It's kind of interesting, right? Okay. Security. Advertised as suitable for personal identification tasks because they are engineered to be tamper resistant. Chip usually implements a cryptographic algorithm for recovering some of the algorithm's internal state. There's an on-chip private key. Onboard microprocessor. Benefits and advantages are two different things. I like that. Okay. Benefits, I don't know. I couldn't tell you the difference, right? Okay. Benefits, smart cards directly related to the volume of information and applications that are programmed for use on a card. Single contactless smart card can be programmed with multiple banking credentials. Multi-factor and proximity authentication. Ooh, proximity authentication. That's kind of wild. Significantly increase. Wow. A smart card can be programmed to only allow a contactless transaction if it is also within the range of another device like a uniquely paired mobile phone. Okay, I've definitely never heard about that from my bank or anywhere else. That's wild. Okay, that's pretty cool. That sounds very secure. Okay, governments and regional authorities save money because of improved security, better data, and reduced processing costs. These help reduce public budgets or enhance public services. Individuals have better security and more convenience with their using smart cards that perform multiple services. For example, they only need to replace one card if their wallet is stolen. It can reduce duplication and even provide emergency medical. Okay, advantages, flexibility, multiple functions, security, electronic key rings, encryption devices. Okay, smart cards and electronic commerce. The physical things, account holders, computer hosts malware, smart card security model may be broken, malware can override the communication, modify a transaction unknown by the banks, pin in the transaction amount to the reader, manually entered onto the personal computer, preventing point of sale malware. Okay, all right. I think I've read enough about this. So to me, this seems like, and maybe I don't have the best understanding, but from what I'm getting here, right, we have a card that has some sort of unique authentication property, right? So for the purposes of this discussion, we'll say it's a private key. Maybe there's a lot more going on under the hood. Maybe there's more information, but there's some sort of unique information on that card that cannot be replicated elsewhere. So the card can prove its authenticity. Like the authenticity of the card can be verified through some sort of cryptographic procedure. That, to me, does not feel like single sign-on at all. Okay, that feels like an authentication factor, right? This is something you have, right? Somebody could steal this card, and then they would steal that authentication factor, right? And everything in here about also needing a PIN, that's multi-factor authentication. It's something you know, right? So this does not actually seem like a single sign-on. I mean, it doesn't, I don't even understand how it's in this list, right? Additional software applications also use the smart card without prompting the user to re-enter credentials. It's just your initial, the first sign-on requires something you have and something you know, and then future sign-ons only require something you have. So maybe they remember the something you know, right? This doesn't, this is not like, this is another form of authentication, which is cool, and I definitely understand the benefits of the smart card now. I have definitely had ID cards with RFID chips, at jobs, at schools. That is not a new concept at all. I guess I was waiting for somewhere in this article for it to explain how this card alone creates a single sign-on. That is not what happened, okay? All right, let's go to the next one here. Integrated Windows authentication. Now this is interesting, right? Because we saw that Windows has Active Directory aware applications that are Kerberos based. Okay. A term associated with Microsoft products and refers to SPNEGO, Kerberos, and NTLM SP authentication protocols with respect to SSPI functionality introduced in Windows 2000. It included automatically authenticated connections between Microsoft IIS and Internet Explorer, cross-platform Active Directory integration vendors. Now, this is interesting. Look at that. They refer to SPNEGO, Spanego, I'm reading that, okay, Kerberos, and NTLM, all like in a series. Okay, so these two, obviously Kerberos is mentioned in here, so I don't think integrated Windows authentication is actually something different than Kerberos. I think it's like a general term for the Microsoft products like Kerberos, right? What is SSPI functionality? Security Support Provider Interface. Security-related operations such as authentication. I wonder if this is like when you first log into Windows, how, if it's like a network machine, right? Uh, well, no, that's just basic networking. Okay, but maybe this is, okay. So you may be, using a AAA server or certificates or 509 or, all these different security procedures to figure out the credentials and validate the credentials on your machine. But from a Windows perspective, you need an API that performs the security related, operations such as authentication itself. Okay, that makes sense. Let's look at this last one before I start going into these links here. Security assertion markup language. Did I need to go into this? Maybe I should have, sorry. Okay. Whoa, look at all of these. What is NTLM? Security protocols. NTLM SSP. GSS API. Okay. Uses the security features of Windows clients and servers. Unlike basic authentication or digest authentication, initially, it does not prompt users for a username and password. The current Windows user information on the client computer is supplied to the web browser, by the web browser, through a cryptographic exchange involving hashing with the web server. If the authentication exchange initially fails to identify the user, the web browser will prompt the user for a Windows user account name and password. Integrated Windows authentication itself is not a standard or authentication protocol selected as an option. This implies the underlying security mechanism should be used in preferential order. If the Kerberos provider is functional and a Kerberos ticket can be obtained for the target and any associated settings permit Kerberos authentication to occur, the Kerberos 5 protocol will be attempted. Kerberos 5! Whoa. Otherwise, NTLM SSP authentication is attempted. Similarly, Spinago to allow initiators and acceptors to negotiate either Kerberos or... Okay, so Spinago may be a different protocol that lets you choose between Kerberos and NTLM SSP. Automatically authenticated connections. Okay. This is interesting. So it's like Microsoft is automatically authenticating with some device on the network, some server. Your Windows client comes on, it authenticates with some server, and that authentication can then be used for web applications. That's my understanding of this. Maybe I'm wrong, right? That the supported web browsers, it's happening in the browser, which is interesting. Does not work over HTTP proxy servers, therefore it is best used in intranets where all the clients are within a single domain. It may work with other web browsers if they have been configured to pass the user's login credentials to the server requesting authentication. Okay, once you have a Kerberos ticket. Interesting. Okay, so let's see if this is correct. Hold on. Often pronounced Spinago, GSS API pseudo mechanism used by client-server software to negotiate the choice of security technology. Spinago is used when a client application wants to authenticate a remote server, but neither end is sure what authentication protocol. Okay, so this is to choose between Kerberos and NTLM SSP. NTLAN. Good Lord. NTLAN support security support provider is a binary messaging protocol used by Microsoft Security Support Provider Interface to facilitate NTLM challenge response authentication and negotiate the integrity and confidentiality operations. SSI authentication is used, including server message block, CIFS. Okay, that CIFS is a network term. Familiar. Oh, good lord. Okay, so I think we need to know what SSPI is, and I think NTLM, Network LAN Manager, is also going to be necessary. And probably security support provider interface. Good lord. Okay. I just keep opening more tabs. Okay, so let's start at the top here. NTLM, NTLAN, new technology. Oh man, it's from a long time ago if they call it new. Okay. In a Windows network, new technology LAN Manager is a suite of Microsoft security protocols intended to provide authentication, integrity, and confidentiality to others. The successor to the authentication program, Microsoft LAN Manager, an older Microsoft product. It's an authentication protocol. NTLM passwords considered weak. Challenge response authentication protocol, 3 messages to authenticate a client in a connection-oriented environment. 4th additional member message if integrity is desired. Client establishes a network path to the server and sends a negotiate message advertising its capabilities. Server sends a challenge message to establish the identity of the client. Finally, the client responds with an authenticate message. Uses one or both of 2 hashed passwords, both of which are stored on the server, and through which through a lack of salting are password equivalent, meaning if you grab the hash value from the server, you can authenticate without knowing the actual password. The 2 are the LM hash, a DES-based function applied to the first 14 characters of the password converted to the traditional 8-bit PC car set for the language, and the NT hash. Both hash values are 16 bytes each. Oh my gosh. Wait a second. Also uses one of 2 one-way functions. Is a one-way function just a hash function? What is going on here? Hold on. The client performs an operation involving the challenge and a secret shared between the client and server, specifically one of the 2 password hashes described above. The client returns the 24-byte result of the computation. In fact, NTLM v1 computations are usually made using both hashes, and both 24-byte results are sent. The server verifies that the client has computed the correct result, and from this infers the possession of its secret and hence authenticity. What? Is a key used to DES encrypt the 64-bit challenge. The 3 encryptions of the challenge are reunited to form the 24-byte hash, and the NT hash are returned as the response, but this is configurable. Okay. I don't understand this operation. Let me read through this again. Okay, both the hashes produce 16-byte quantities. the hashes. These are the hashes of the password. Two different hashes, using two different hashing algorithms, right? 5 bytes of zeros are appended to attain 21 bytes. The 21 bytes are separated into 3 7-byte quantities. Each of these 56-bit quantities is used as a key to DES encrypt the 64-bit challenge. The 3 encryptions of the challenge are reunited to form a 24-byte response. Both the response using the LM hash and the NT hash are returned as the response, but this is configurable. Okay, so they have a hash that is 16 bytes long. They add 5 bytes to it to get 21 bytes. Then they get 3 7-byte quantities. And for each one, they encrypt the 64-bit challenge. And then they merge those 3 together to get those 3 8-byte things together to get a 24-byte response. And they can use one of each. Okay. All right. That cleared things up, right? So what it is you enter a password on your client. They hash that client once, and that's why it has to be saltless, because they're both hashing, right? The client and the network both know the hashed password without salting, right? That's what they both know. So it's kind of like a shared key. The shared key is the hash, right? And then they basically just use that hash to encrypt, right? Symmetric encryption. Okay, that's clear. Does this get more complicated? Man, each of these is probably more complicated. Okay. Replacement for NTLM v1, enhancing NTLM security by hardening the protocol against many spoofing attacks and adding the ability for the server to authenticate the client. Okay. 16-byte hash of server challenge. 2 responses to an 8-byte server challenge. Random generated client challenge of the users. Two responses differ in the format of the client challenge. Uses an 8-byte random value for this challenge. In order to verify the response, the server must receive as part of the response, the client challenge. For this shorter response, an 8-byte challenge is appended to the 16-byte response, 24-byte package. Unofficial documentation. Oh, see, I think I need to. I'm still not quite getting this. Okay. Okay, so there's a server challenge, which is 8 bytes, and a client challenge, which is 8 bytes. Okay. These are complicated algorithms, so I feel like understanding them is important, right? Because that first algorithm is kind of compared to Kerberos, it's a little buns, right? Like it's just not gonna work, right? First off, there's no salting on that. I mean, it's basically password authentication with fewer steps. All right. Okay. 2 responses to an 8-byte server challenge. Each response contains a 16-byte hash of the server challenge. Okay, each response contains a 16-byte 2 responses. Okay. A fully, partially randomly generated client challenge and a hash of the user's password and other identifying information. Okay. Okay. And then the shorter response uses an 8-byte random value for this challenge. In order to verify the response, The server must receive as part of the response the client challenge. For the shorter response, the 8-byte client challenge appended to the 16-byte response makes a 24-byte package. Okay. The second response sent by NTLM v2 uses a variable length client challenge which includes the current time, 8-byte random value, CC2 in the box. Okay. Second client challenge, the domain name and some standard format stuff. The response must include a copy of this client challenge and therefore is variable length. In non-official documentation, this response is termed NTV2. LMV2 and NTV2 hash the client and server challenge with the NT hash of the user's password and other identifying information. Okay. There's a second client challenge with identifying information. And then the v2 hash is a hash of the NT hash, username, and domain name. And then LMV2 is a hash of the v2 hash, server challenge, client challenge, server challenge, second client challenge. Response is all of these put together. All right. Good Lord. Okay, so this is kind of ridiculous, but the only real information, the only private information needed for all of this is this NT hash, right? Which is still the same thing. It's just a hash of the password, but it's wrapped up in many more layers with other identifying information. And the server knows this hash and separately is probably given this identifying information, the username and the domain name and the time. Probably knows the time, the username and the domain name, and then it's also given the challenge separately, right? These challenges. Oh yeah, it's right here, right? It's given CC2, it's given CC, right? So it's given the client challenges, and it has to ask for the server challenge first, right? So they negotiate the client challenge, yeah. The server challenge comes here, and then we give it a bunch of stuff that's random, a bunch of information about us, and then essentially our hash, and we hash it all together, and they know our hash because they know they know the hash of our password, and then they can reperform the same operation. Okay, so it's honestly, it's very similar to this. It's like very similar. There's an added bit of these client things to make it more complicated, but that's what it is. Okay, a session protocol, authentication from NTLM v1, session security from NTLM v2. Okay, so one way or another, right, this is still password authentication. It's a symmetric, they're using symmetric encryption, right? Well, it's not really encryption, but it's like there's a shared key. It doesn't really matter that it's the hash of a password. If you hash the password before you send it, then your hash is basically the password. What they have is they have a shared key that they both know that they insert into hashing algorithms to identify, to authenticate each other. Which is interesting, right? I mean, yeah, very interesting. Okay, it makes me feel like maybe I should redesign this business here. Like I'm sending a password hash directly. That's probably dangerous. I mean, that's one thing, right? Sending this hash. Instead, this API could look very much like that password authentication that they were talking about in NTLM v1, right? Or NTLM v2 even, right? Where really I'm sending you a bunch of information, there's a bunch of challenges, and in doing all of that, you authenticate that I have my password. Okay, yeah, let me add that note. replace with NTLM ideas. I'm not going to say replace, incorporate. I don't know that I'm going to do it the same way they did, because there's a lot of jumping around in there. But for password authentication, that's interesting. Okay, Spinago we don't need. Okay, what was the security support provider interface? Wait, what's the security? This is the same thing. Okay, no wonder there's so many. Okay, component of Windows API that performs security-related operations such as authentication. Common interface to several security support providers. A security support provider is a dynamic link library that makes one or more security packages available to apps. Okay. Whoa, negotiate SSP provides single sign-on capability. What are you? Okay. Okay, so Kerberos is an SSP. Okay, that's the name of the thing I'm trying to look up. SSPs. Or SSPIs. No, SSPs. SSPI is the thing that connects to the SSPs, the security support providers. Okay. But to be clear, these are for networks. I don't know that this is for like the internet. I could be wrong about that. I mean, the internet is a network, but I could be wrong about all this. Okay. Spinago is... Okay. I've seen enough! Okay. And then what was this security assertion markup language? XML-based method for exchanging user security information between an SAML identity provider? What is that? And an SAML secure service provider. Single sign-on exchanges. A user wielding a user agent, usually a web browser, is called the subject in a SAML. User requests a web resource protected by an SAML service provider. The service provider, wishing to know the identity of the user, issues an authentication request to the SAML identity provider through the user agent. The identity provider is the one that provides the user credentials. The service provider trusts the user information from the identity provider to provide access to its services or resources. Interesting. Whoa. A bit too far there. That's what happened. Put this back up here, close that. Okay, let's look at these. Identity provider. Wow. System entity that issues authentication assertions in conjunction with a single sign-on. Authority, system entity that issues a system that produces assertions. Likewise, produces attribute assertions. Identity provider via a web browser from a relying on party via a web browser authenticates the browser user principal, responds to the relying party with an SAML authentication assertion for the principal. The relying on party, the relying party and the relying on party receives and accepts the authentication assertion is called the service provider. What in the world is going on? Hold on, let me look up the whole markup language, because I think I'm getting lost in the sauce here. An open standard for exchanging authentication and authorization data between parties, in particular between an identity provider and a service provider. Based markup language for security assertions. Okay, I should have read this one first. the principal, a human user, the identity provider, and the service provider. The principal use case addressed by SAML, the principal requests a service from the service provider. The service provider requests and obtains an authentication assertion from the identity provider. On the basis of this assertion, the service provider can make an access control decision, that is, decide whether or not to perform the service for the connected principal. Is a subject, principal within the context of a particular security domain about which something is being asserted. The subject is usually, but not necessarily, a human. Interchangeably in this document. Okay, the subject and the principal. Before delivering the subject-based assertion from identity provider to the service provider, the identity provider may request some information from the principal, such as a username and password, in order to authenticate the principal. SAML specifies the content of the assertion that is passed from the identity provider to the service provider. One identity provider may provide SAML assertions to many service providers. The method of authentication at the identity provider. Wow. Okay, I get it. I get it. This is interesting. Okay. This is interesting. This is very interesting. Okay, I'm glad I got here. All right. So, in our design, right, we have an authentication server and a ticket granting server. We have a key distribution center from Kerberos, right, that is authenticating people, right? And then we have a service, so a server that is providing a service to somebody. In this case, the user logs in here first with the key distribution center, and then when they get to the service, can look at a token or something and know that, they've been authenticated. Conversely, in this sense, they're saying, what if your key distribution center, your authentication server, is the identity provider, and it's someone completely separate from the service provider, which is our server down here. And instead, the user would come directly to the service provider and say, hey, I want to use this service. And the service provider, instead of performing any of their own validation, says, well, let me just go over to the identity provider first to guarantee your identity. And the identity provider reaches out to you and says, okay, let's handle this. This is interesting, right? Or maybe you've already logged in once with the identity provider and the identity provider can vouch for your identity. Very cool. Very cool. Okay, so there's a disassociation between the person providing identity services and the the machine providing identity services and the machine providing services, right? And this is an open standard for exchanging that information, the authentication and authorization data between parties, specifically between the identity provider and service provider. So this is an interesting standard for exchanging information between, like in our case, our key distribution center and the service server. How does it work? It's just telling me what an open standard is. A set of XML-based protocol messages, profiles. I love a diagram. Okay. A shibboleth. Whoa. I recently heard that term. The definition of it, interesting. Okay. No idea what's going on in this. That's not, sorry. I thought it was going to be a use case diagram. Schema, signature, encryption, SOAP. Authentication statements, attribute statements, authorization, decision statements. The attributes seems like an OAuth thing. Like you can save attributes. Like the identity provider may have information about you, right? Or some information tied to your account that is being stored. And it can also, provide some authority on that too. Okay, response, assertion, attribute statement, bindings, precursor, completely separates the binding concept from the underlying profile. A web browser SSO profile. SAML. This is very interesting. Okay, so the first thing, there's a few aspects to this. So one thing I think is clear. An important use case that SAML addresses is web browser single sign-on. Single sign-on is relatively easy to accomplish within a security domain, using cookies, for example. But extending SSO across security domains is more difficult and resulted in the proliferation of non-interoperable proprietary technologies. The SAML web browser SSO profile was specified to standardize and promote interoperability. In practice, SAML SSO is most commonly used for authentication into cloud-based business software. Wow. Okay, this is like almost exactly what, well, it's not exactly what I'm trying to do, but it's interesting. I'm trying to design an identity provider to a certain extent, but it looks like this is a differentiation that I didn't realize could be made and was being provided by different people separately, which is kind of cool. Okay. Couple things to note here. SAML does not specify the method of authentication at the identity provider. Okay, so here's what I don't understand. Why does the service provider trust the information? Is the web browser providing the information to the service provider, or is the identity provider providing it? Subject-based assertion from the identity provider to the service provider. The identity provider may request some information from the principal. The content of the assertion that is passed from it to many service providers. Okay. I get it. Okay, so this is interesting. You go to the service provider, and then the service provider reaches out to the identity provider, and the identity provider may then reach out to you, right? It may prompt you for a username and password in a pop-up or in another screen, or it may, you know, I don't know, provide information somewhere else, but it's like there's direct communication between the service provider and the identity provider. Okay, that's interesting, which is something I was thinking about, right? Okay, that came up in the first video, this idea of maybe the service provider goes directly to here, right, and just does it. But that seems very close to reauthentication. Okay. that was good. I think we knocked this out. I think I want to save that link though. This is probably okay. SAML, right, is good, and then NTLM SSP. We want to keep both of those. Those are compiling a list of links that must be in the documentation at the end of the day, right? So this one goes in, this one goes in. They're all Wikipedia links, nonetheless. NTLM, and then we need that Kerberos. Absolutely, absolutely. That is still. I don't think I've seen enough to completely change, but I do want to go back through all of my ideas. I feel like I know more now than I did before. Okay. Okay. So, oh, one other thing I want to look up. I'm going to get rid of this one. Is we were looking at some Kubernetes, some sort of public key PKI, like cluster specific PKI, cluster PKI, or something like that. I forget what it was called, but there's some service, natively offered by Kubernetes that like can populate the keys on these things, right? So we might want to look into that. Okie dokie. Single sign-off expert. Okay, so we're not quite done here. I think one thing I do not quite have an answer for is, okay, so from NTLM, right, we got that our password-based authentication is kind of terrible, right? This is not enough. We need something big. And I'm going to put NTLM v2. Get specific. Okay, the second thing is, right now, we're assuming that there's some sort of token, right, that I'm providing that the service server can use, right, to just because it has this key pair. Oh, sorry. Just because it relies on this token, right? I don't know that like. I don't know that that's enough. Like, say I provide a token that has enough information in it, inside of it, to verify that this user is authenticated. And maybe a time? Okay, we haven't talked about token expiration. Then the service provides enough information to the session to say, to this particular session, to say that this person was authenticated. Or sorry, the ticket granting server provides that. But how does the service server know the identity? It's too many layers. I'm trying to understand. I think I have to design these tokens a little bit more, right? Because there's a disconnect here, right? See, is this TGS session token for a specific ticket granting server? I mean, how would you even know, right? You're just providing a generic token. See, that's okay. That's a tough thing here, right? And something that I have a question about in the original Kerberos thing, right? When we were looking at this idea, right, I said that it was unclear if there's one black key on every single TGS and every single service server, and that seemed ridiculous to me. That that seems bad to have the same key on so many different machines. And then if you lose one key, one key gets corrupted and you lose everything. It's like a single point of failure. And so I assumed, but every combination, especially if you have a ton of ticket granting servers and a ton of service servers, and a ton of authentication servers, that's a lot of different pair combinations of keys. And also, when you authenticate, you don't know which ticket granting server you're going to go to, because if you define that up front, that's it's kind of useless, right? So then they'd all have to have the same key. These are holes that got to be addressed, right? That I didn't even realize when I was making that first video, right? So, okay, one important thing here. This token needs to work with any ticket granting server. So what if the only thing that's done is it says, let's write down TGS session token is let's say it's AS private key. Encrypted with the AS private key, and it is the username, timestamp, thinking about token expiration, and something else. It's going to be, okay, let's just say it's those two things for now. When the ticket granting server gets this, when the ticket granting server gets this, right, and we verify the token, all we have to do is use the public key. Right, we use the public key, which we know has a certificate authority. We trust the internal certificate authority. We know that the public key is from an authentication server. Also, to tell authentication servers, ticket granting servers, and service servers apart, I had the idea of using different certificate authorities. Like instead of just putting one on every machine, we could put 3 on every machine. And so just by knowing which certificate authority it is, like you would already know what type of server is being authenticated. Okay, it's not on here, but that's an idea that I might reuse. Okay. So basically, you use the public key, the AS public key, and you get the username and password. And they're also providing the username, and they're saying which service they want to do. Okay? And so I say, all right, service session token. That is the username, of course. Okay, so instead of the AS private key, it is the TGS private key. The username. See, how would you know it's the AS though? We'd have to pass the AS in. Of username and timestamp plus AS hostname, right? You got to know the hostname in order to know which public key. Right? Because then you could look up the hostname. How do you get the hostname though? You gotta pass in a public key. I don't know about this. Things are a bit fishy here, right? These don't quite make sense. I think things are a bit off here. Because how am I looking up that host name? What if it was made after I created that server? I don't want to be constantly updating or having a shared DB of host names and public keys, right? So it's got to be the public key, AS public key. Okay, how about this? We pass in the AS public key and the certificate, right? Maybe those are the same thing. When the TGS gets it, it says, okay, here's a public key, right? That I can check the certificate back to the certificate authority and know that this public key validly belongs to some authentication server in my cluster. Then I can use the public key to decrypt this and say that authentication server knew the username, validated this user at this timestamp, right? And that's my token, that this user was authenticated at this timestamp, and that information was passed back to whoever got authenticated, right? They went through this business. Should there be a user element to this too? I guess when this TGS session token is passed back, it'll be within some sort of TLS encryption. It's scary to think that if anybody else gets this key, though, that at least until this token expires, they could pass it. But I guess that's true of any token. Like, the token could fall into the wrong hands and temporarily, that authentication is out there. I guess we could also encrypt this again with like the password hash or something and send it back and have them unencrypt or decrypt, I guess. Unencrypt. That's ridiculous. It's getting late. Okay. We could use some other form of encryption since we now have some sort of shared key together, right? Especially using the NTLM v2 ideas. Okay, so whatever. Session token gets back to whoever gets back to. The ticket granting server see, we could do something so that only the ticket granting server could read this, but then we'd have to know which ticket granting server it was going to go to. Now, I don't really want that, right? So let's say now we verify the TGS token. We get the certificate. We know it's from. We get the AS public key. We know the AS public key is from an authentication server, and we know that they validated this username and timestamp. Then we go to the service session token, or we create a service session token, which is using the TGS private key for a username, same timestamp, and we add in the service. Like this service was authenticated, and then maybe like service timestamp. So we say like the original authentication timestamp was thou, and then this is when the service was done. And if either of these tokens expires, we cut the session, right? Because maybe this goes a little bit longer than this does, right? The service timestamp. Yeah. Okay. Plus, and then again, I think we need the TGS public key and the certificate. Okay, and then the service server verifies the service session by getting the public key, trusting the certificate, and then TDS private key. Okay, so there's two big things that I don't fully understand. What is the purpose of my middleman here? Okay, I feel like I understood it during the first video, but now it just seems irrelevant, right? Like, we create the TDS private key. We could just hand this directly over into the service session, and the service session would say, okay, this was an authentication server and authenticated this person at this time. The individual service session, like this really, to me, feels like the only purpose it provides is if I want some level of authorization to accompany the service. Like if I want this ticket granting server to include authorization information. Right? So like you come to me with your service and I say, oh, you know what, this is the role you are at that service, or this is other information about that service, and then I provide it. Or who's allowed to use this service? Are you allowed to use this service? But this service probably has its own, I mean, obviously it has to know who the users are. So it's going to get that username, that user profile, and have its own authorization information and either reject you or let you in, right? I feel more and more like this is an identity provider, and this is a service provider, and this is some in between. Okay, so maybe I don't understand the point of the ticket granting server. Okay, let's look at the known vulnerabilities of Kerberos and see if we can figure out what the ticket granting server provides. Maybe just from looking at those vulnerabilities, we'll start to get it. Now let's see what information they had. We have that client address validity. Oh, the address of the machine. That's genius. We just put the address on there too. It's this client from this machine. I get addresses could be faked, but like, yeah, that's valuable. Okay. Well, can addresses really be faked if they have to come back? The return messages aren't going to come in, as long as everything requires setting up a session first. Okay. Okay, client address and validity. Client address validity, client address validity, and then timestamps. Look at that. Okay. Ticket validity period. Okay, one thing I do like, okay, so there are things that my design is missing from here. One thing that I like is that the client's secret key, there's a separate, there are two messages passed in here, right? There's something for the client and then something for the next server. Something for the client, something for the next server. And that something for the client is then used by the next server, right? To give something for the client, right? So there's this added layer to it. All right, let's keep going. I'm missing that. Okay, this is what I'm missing here that my algorithm is missing, right? It's not just that the server needs to authenticate the client. The client is constantly authenticating each of these servers to a certain degree, right? The client is authenticating that the authentication server is real, because it passed something, right, that could only be unlocked with my key, right? And something for the next guy. So there was something for the client in there too. And then the client, provides that information to the ticket granting server. And then the ticket granting server sends something back, again encrypted with the client's key. I guess the client, that could be any information, right? The client doesn't understand what the keys are, right? So it's not like a re-authentication. But there's an element of everybody gets a key. Everybody gets a key, right? Like, this guy's got the black key, client has the blue key, the ticket granting server had the yellow key, the client had the red key, and the authentication server had the green key. And it's like this chain, right? The green key gets us to the red key, which gets us to the yellow key, which gets us to the blue key, which gets us to the black key, which gets us, in business. Okay. Where's the vulnerabilities? Drawbacks and limitations. Here we go. Time availability period. No more than 5 minutes apart. That's probably not a big, NTP probably takes care of all that. Administration protocol is not standardized and differs between implementation servers. Password changes described. Case of symmetric cryptography adoption. Or asymmetric. Look at that, look at that, look at that, look at that. Can be used using asymmetric public key cryptography since all authentications are controlled by a centralized key distribution center. Compromise of this authentication infrastructure will allow an attacker to impersonate any user. Each network service that requires a different host name will need its own set of Kerberos keys. This complicates virtual hosting in clusters. Kerberos requires user accounts and services to have a trusted relationship to the Kerberos token server. The required client trust makes creating staged environments, separate domains for test environments, pre-production environment, and production environment difficult. Either domain trust relationships need to be created that prevent a strict separation of environment domains, or additional user clients need to be provided for each environment. Encryption like AES. Okay. Those are not the kind of vulnerabilities I was expecting. Like, there's no attacks that came up. These are interesting, right? These are limitations. They're only vulnerabilities. Let's see if I just type in Kerberos vulnerabilities. It's good to know, right? Don't use DES. Powerful Kerberos attacks that analysts hate. Here we go. Whoa. User's hash stored within memory upon authentication. Pass the hash attack. Before Kerberos, it was just that. This must be specific for every machine they want to access because there is no password. Okay. All right, common attacks. ASREC roasting. ASREC roasting. Main forms of attack. ASREC roasting and Kerberos. I don't know what roasting is, but I probably should. It's in both of these names. Okay. It's possible when Kerberos pre-authentication is not configured. This allows anyone to request authentication data for a user. In return, the KDC would provide an ASREP message. Authentication server request. Oh, so, okay. So hold on. They're talking about the actual implementation of Kerberos, like Kerberos 5 on Microsoft, what we were looking at earlier. Now, I never looked up the actual implementation of Kerberos. I was just trying to understand the general idea of how it works, right, so that I can design my own system. Also, Kerberos is for network security within a trusted, not within a trusted domain, because you can have an untrusted network. But I think it's for within an intranet, right? Because it's the machines doing it. There's a Microsoft implementation and a Linux implementation. Okay. This allows anyone to request authentication data for a user. In return, the KDC would provide. So there might be an ASREC. So you get a request and response. Authentication server request, authentication server response. Message is encrypted using the user's password. It's possible to perform an offline brute force attack to try and retrieve the user's password. Oh, so it looks like the initial authentication server request and response has some sort of shared password. Okay. Key they want to attach, which can be found using other enumeration techniques. If an account has pre-authentication disabled, an attacker can obtain an encrypted ticket granting ticket for the affected account without any prior authentication. These tickets are vulnerable to offline password attacks using a tool like Hashcat or John the Ripper. Interesting. Okay, so I don't have it up here anymore, but at the very top of that diagram that I keep referring to on the Kerberos Wikipedia page, the user initially just sends in like a client and a timestamp, and the response comes back with their encrypted with their symmetric password, right? And so they're saying that there's this offline attack that can just happen. And whether pre-authentication is, configured or not configured, they're going to get something back, and they can just use an offline tool then. Okay, so there's no authentication in the original one. And this is called roasting for some reason. And service accounts that allows an attacker to perform an offline password cracking against the Active Directory account associated with the service. Or a system. Domain join machine to perform the attack. Impersonate a user to access another resource. Authentication is disabled, and the final resource responds to the service as if it had the first user's rights. What? Oh, wow, that's interesting. Kerberos delegation. Never heard of that. So one service can use another service using the user information that was already provided. roasting attacks. I didn't really understand Kerberos. It seems like the real question is anytime information is provided, anytime like a symmetric key is used to encrypt any information, I guess back when they were using DES instead of AES, you could just have a ball with the offline password attacks if you knew their username. Okay, unconstrained delegation. Wow, delegation seems absolutely insane. But the idea is you might have multiple services running, and you might want to authenticate each of those services to a user individually. And instead of going back to the ticket granting service for another ticket, wow, they just pass on information. Okay, delegation is crazy. I didn't even think about delegation. That's wild. Wow. Silver ticket and pass the ticket. The KRB TGT accounts password hash. Okay, I think I get it. This is saying you impersonate the authentication server by signing your own ticket granting tickets, which gives you the ability to start any services. A silver ticket is when you impersonate the ticket granting ticket. Interesting. Okay. So even though the golden ticket gives you more power, impersonating the authentication server means everyone still needs to go through the ticket granting server and get another ticket before they access any machines. So there's a paper trail because you still have to go to the TGSs. Whereas if you forge a silver ticket, you can go straight to the services, leave the logs behind. But it's probably only for like individual services. It's less powerful. Only access one single machine. Okay. All right. So this was worth it. Roasting is an interesting idea, right? Probably not as concerning. I mean, they're roasting uh, suggestions was to just have really long symmetric keys, and in this case, private public keys. So we're not as concerned about the roasting. Okay, so here's the thing. The user what if we lock all this in? What if we send this back with NTLM v2 ideas? NTLM v2 ideas. Isn't that kind of interesting? Like, we're using NTLM v2 for our password authentication, but then when they send the private key back, they use the same NTLM v2 ideas to send the private key back. So the user at least knows, that my information, my private password was known by someone there. Right? That's the value. Right? It's like two-way NTLM v2. Right? Private key, and then we get the session token. And so we know this session token is coming from someone who knew my password at least. We pass that to the ticket granting server. This has the internal certificate authority. So it has the trust, right? We don't have to go back to the authentication server. Again, I feel like the service server could just directly receive this token and say, oh, okay, I know who you are, unless we want special authorization to be happening here. There's like a control and authorization standpoint that I just don't fully understand the need for. The service server can just have its own authorization. All you're doing is verifying the private key. And every time you get one of these private keys, right, the service server can say, hey, I know that certificate authority. I trust that certificate authority. Here's the public key. And there's the private key that this user logged in. And its username, timestamp, its username, address, and timestamp, right? IP address, right? And we say, okay, that is a username, an address, and a timestamp, the public key, and the certificate. And then the service server goes, okay, you pass the certificate around. Certificates are public. Here's the certificate. I say, all right, there you go. Internal certificate authority. I don't think we need this ticket granting server. At least right now, I don't see the benefit. I think each service should be in charge of its own authorization. It seems weird to globalize authorization like that. I wonder if there's user information that we might want across multiple applications, like a user is part of some sort of admin, or has a specific role, or is part of a specific group, and that kind of information will be valuable, and the application won't get it itself. I don't know. Service-specific user information, like service-specific user information, we'll probably just keep that on the server. Okay. Okay, so maybe we can get rid of the entire ticket granting server. We still have a few other questions here. I'm going to cut this out. Well, the golden ticket and silver ticket and pass the ticket seem like, what if your ticket gets out to somebody else? I think, or sorry, what if one of these private keys get out? I think, you know, keeping the authentication server. Oh, right, because there's a separate database. Right, the golden ticket, you just have to fool the database. But again, this public key, this private key, maybe we're putting too much on that. But each authentication server will have its own. Okay, ticket granting server. Service server. Okay, the Kerberos thing. Token expiration seems kind of simple, right? You could just have a default expiration. You could put an expiration in here. You could put a timestamp of when it was initiated and a timestamp of when it's no longer working. Single sign off. Now that seems complicated. Once I give out this token, how do I ever get it back? This is something where SAML makes sense, right? Where they're checking every time with the identity provider. How does single sign off work? Or SLO, single logout. Technical complexities and lack of standardization. SAML, SLO guide. See, with SAML, it makes sense, right? Like the identity provider learns that you've logged out and stops authenticating you. Ay, ay, ay. SLO is what they call it. See, maybe I need SAML. Hold the phone. Okay. Is there any Kerberos SLO business? Manage all session states across all the different applications. An SLO event. Oh, man, doesn't that just throw a wrench into this entire design? An event, like you would come to the authentication server, log out, and the authentication server would send an event to everybody, letting you know that you logged out. Or in reality, sending an event to each ticket granting server, probably in Kerberos, right? And then the ticket granting server would have kept track of which services you logged into, and then send. It just sounds terrible. Just talking about it sounds terrible. Ugh, maybe I need SAML, right? This idea of the user comes to the service server, the service provider goes to the identity provider every time, and the identity provider provides identity services. Gosh. Yeah. I like the simplicity of what I have, but it doesn't, it relies on timestamps expiring. The idea of SLO just doesn't make any sense. What you could do, right, is instead of sending this information in a private key back to the user, instead of giving them a token, you could just keep track of a username from this address and this timestamp. And then whenever the user tries to get into a service server with their username, the service provider, I should say, reaches out to the authentication server with a username and an address. And the authentication server says, yep, they logged in at this timestamp. They assert, right? They assert. The identity provider asserts an address and a timestamp, basically a session, essentially a session, right? It asserts the existence of a session with this service provider. Ugh. Do I switch to SAML? All right, I need more SAML information. That's just a fact. I need to look more into it. I need to understand this. The assertions, the protocols. Directly to an identity. A service provider makes a query directly to an identity provider over a secure back channel. Corresponding types of authentication query, attribute query, authorization decision query. Assertion query, just bindings. Ay. I don't know. This is funky, right? It's like the service provider. The service provider is going to the authentication server. The identity provider. I should say identity. You know what? I keep talking over myself. Let's say this is our identity provider. And this is our service provider. And the service provider, okay, so the service provider is constantly going to the identity provider and asking it to assert information about the user, right, to verify user information. I don't know about this idea that every time you want to use the service, the service has to reach out to the authentication server through a secure back channel. I guess if everything's within the same cluster, that's possible. Might be the only way to do SLO. Is there value in doing both of these? Ooh. Or what if there's a token passed here that you need to receive from your service provider, to the identity provider? Like the identity provider needs something from that token to know that the same person who got that token is the person requesting from the service provider. Like they have to give the same token back to you. Ooh. Some sort of token validation, right? Yeah. Yeah, what about that? Hold on. What if we also implement SAML here, right? What if we need to verify service token and then we do perform SAML with authentication server? With a different authentication server. You get sent to an authentication server. reaches out to another authentication server. To the validation server. Okay, I'm going to stop here for tonight. This is an interesting idea, right? A different authentication server. What if this session leaves a mark on at least two servers, or on all the servers, so that later a service server can reach out to a different authentication server, can verify the service session token from the original authentication server, and then verify with a different authentication server that the session has not been canceled, right? That you have not been signed out. Oh, wait a second. This would allow you to stop signing in. But you would still need an event to actually sign out of each application. Oh my gosh. Signing out, SLO still requires a message bus though. Like it still requires some sort of event processing. Because how else would each service know that you've signed out? All right. Sorry. Lots of my thoughts here. Uh, Getting rid of the ticket granting server does remove one layer of security, right? Because it means if somebody gets the session token, they can get onto any service without going through the TGS. There's a layer there, right? I've made it that much quicker. And maybe SAML is a better way to go about this, but then we need a secure back channel for our server and authentication server, which seems difficult. What if the authentication server and the identity provider are two separate people? Like, what if there's an authentication server that authenticates you initially, provides you a token, and makes an entry in the identity provider? Then when the service provider receives your token, it says, okay, this is a token that definitely came from an authentication server. Now I'll check with the identity provider to make sure that this person is still logged in. And it provides like two pieces, right? Like, it can like store a time-based token. Or a username-based token, or something like that, right? I think it would be difficult for someone to break both of them. It would also mean that if this key got out, it doesn't really matter. Like if one authentication server key got out, you still couldn't get your name in the identity provider. Okay, so let's try that. Let's say identity provider is a separate entity. And the identity provider, we will decide next time. Tune back in where we recreate. Okay. And this is how we deal with single sign-off and token expiration. All right, I'm gonna get rid of this. Well, we didn't get too far this week, but a lot of interesting research, and now I think I'm finally going at the speed that I wanted to go, which is incredibly slowly, right? There is no rushing in this design. Maybe next week we'll actually create a diagram. All right, thank you, everyone.